The Interview, a short story by Alan Toner. He arrived at his job interview 15 minutes early. Well, being so punctual was always a good thing, wasn't it? That's what all the career experts recommended. Such punctuality creates a good impression, shows your keenness. Well, he was certainly keen for this job. He just hoped that Lady Luck would smile on him when he went in for his interview. God, it's clammy in here, he thought, fidgeting in his seat uncomfortably as he reached into the inside pockets of his jacket and fished out a white tissue with which he dabbed his sweat-beaded forehead. And it wasn't even as if it was still summer, but it was now late September and getting rather nippy out. They must have extra strong heating in here, he thought. Ah well, if he did get the job, at least he wouldn't be shivering behind his desk when winter eventually did set in. He hated the cold weather. Slipping the tissue back in his pocket, he sat back in the wooden chair, which creaked sharply with the movements, and waited to be called into the interview room. Directly opposite him was a small, well-polished reception counter, behind which sat a pretty young blonde girl. The dark blue blouse she wore accentuated her shining yellow hair, which fell over her shoulders quite palatably. Making no attempt at any further conversation after having signed him in, she just sat there with her nose buried inside a thick, leather-bound book. The book looked to be quite old, as if it had come right out of an antiquarian bookshop. And it could have been his imagination, but he could have sworn that the book actually smelt its age too, as a faint musty odour seemed to assail his nostrils. He found it a little odd that such a young dolly bird should be reading such an ancient book that would have looked more at home in the hands of some tweed-jacketed professor than in the hands of some gorgeous 20-something. The book stood out like a sore thumb, so incongruous was it against the modern surroundings of the reception foyer. Now, if she had been reading a popular chick-lit paperback, well, that would have appeared more appropriate to her age. Still, some young people could occasionally surprise you with their rather unusual tastes in books. For instance, he once knew a young guy who loved reading works about old silent films. Flicking his gaze away from the book engrossed receptionist, he looked all around the visitors' area appraisingly. It was quite a big and spacious setup. Immaculate cream-coloured walls, a fancy plant in the middle of the floor, which was completely covered by a lush red carpet. This posh, imposing building was apparently quite an old one too, but you wouldn't have thought so, considering how shiningly modern and stylish it was. It reminded him of the kind of posh offices he often saw in American soap operas, like Dallas. The thought made him hope, with a touch of dark amusement, that whichever boss would be interviewing him did not share J.R. Ewing's dodgy business traits. The silence of the reception area was suddenly broken by a loud, short scream. Startled, he jolted sharply in his seat. The sound seemed to have come from behind a large door to his left, presumably the one that led into the main workplace. The scream was followed by an equally loud outburst of collective laughter. The waiting man threw a questioning glance across at the receptionist, who just calmly raised her head from her book. A knowing smile spread across her features. "Oh, it's all right," she assured, seeing how startled he was. "Don't worry, it's only our Lil having a bit of fun with her office pals. The Screamer, we call her. She's a real case, always full of devilment and cheekiness. She's just like an overgrown schoolgirl, a little over boisterous at times, I must admit, but still a generally likeable girl. If you're successful at your interview, you'll soon get used to her if the boss puts you on a section." He relaxed back in his seat and forced a brief smile at the receptionist. Yes, I'm sure I will." He did think, however, that he could manage to tolerate one rowdy woman, as long as it was just one, providing the pay was good, which it certainly was for this role. The clock on the wall ticked away. 2 o'clock was fast approaching. The time when he would be summoned into the interview room would soon be upon him. He was starting to feel the butterflies fluttering madly in his stomach. His mouth was as dry as sandpaper. Pre-interview nerves were always a bit of a problem with him, no matter how much of a self-confident image he would attempt to convey. However, on this occasion he seemed to be feeling just that little bit more nervous than usual. Well, he thought, let's hope these jitters subside when I step inside that interview room and try to sell myself to the person who's going to interview me. I want this job badly, so I certainly am going to do my damn best to get it. Right on the dot of 2 p.m, the door of the interview room opened and a tall, dark-haired man of swarthy complexion and clad in a smart black suit stood framed in the doorway. The instant the man's eyes fell on the waiting candidate, his face lit up in a smile of greeting. "Mr. Taylor," the man said, strolling briskly towards the seated candidate and stretching out a hand of welcome. He generated a smell of exceptionally strong aftershave all over the reception area as he approached. Taylor reciprocated the smile as he rose. "Yes, hi." As he shook his host's proffered hand, he winced a little at how strong his grip was. It was more like shaking hands with the Incredible Hulk than with an ordinary office boss. "Very nice to meet you, Mr. Taylor," the smart-suited man said. "I'm Nicholas, the manager of this grand old company. Thank you for coming." He broke off the handshake, much to Taylor's relief, as he thought his fingers were going to be crushed, and, with the same hand, waved back at the open door. "The interview will be held in my office there. Would you like to follow me?" "Sure." As Taylor walked behind the manager, the receptionist glanced up at him and flashed him an encouraging smile. "Good luck," she said. Taylor smiled back at her. "Thanks." Inside the small office, Nicholas closed the door and waved a hand at a small wooden chair that stood in front of a well-burnished desk. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Taylor." "Cheers." Nicholas walked around the desk and eased his frame into a large, black leather armchair that faced Taylor's seat. The chair squeaked sharply as the manager got comfortable in preparation for the interview. On the desk in front of him lay the candidate's CV, which he took a few seconds to peruse before looking up at Taylor to commence the proceedings. "Right then, Mr. Taylor," Nicholas said. "Let us begin, shall we?" "Okay." "Oh, please feel free to help yourself to a glass of water if you need it." He waved to a small bottle and glass which lay on the desk in front of Taylor. Taylor smiled gratefully. "Thank you." "Right, here we go then," Nicholas said. He took another look down at Taylor's CV. I see you have quite a good record of steady employment. No gap-smacking of serial job hopping." He smiled approvingly as he looked back up at Taylor. "I like that in a candidate." Taylor, flattered, smiled. "Thank you." If it was hot outside the reception area, Taylor thought, then it felt even hotter in here. In his tightly buttoned-up collar and tie, plus his clinging suit, he was starting to feel quite sweaty and uncomfortable, and he'd barely been in the room for more than a minute. God, was their central heating strong. He hoped the interview wouldn't last too long before he started to virtually melt. As the intense humidity began to spread to his taste buds, he could certainly envisage himself taking up his host's offer to help himself to a glass of water before the interview concluded. "I see that the last job you had was of the longest duration," Nicholas went on. Taylor nodded. "That's right." Nicholas then sat back in his seat, his deep brown eyes staring, interrogatively, probingly at his candidate. "So why did you decide to leave after being there for so long?" Feeling slightly uneasy at the manager's penetrating stare, a stare that felt just as intense as the man's vice-like handshake earlier, Taylor swallowed hard and did his best not to show even the slightest sign of nerves as he prepared to give a straight, honest answer. "Well," he began, "I just decided that after being there all those years, it was time for a change of scenery. The company had been hit badly by the recession, staff levels were being drastically cut, new policies and changes were being introduced, which I did not agree with, and all this upheaval was rushed through often without the universal consent of the staff. A lot of people were being hurt. This generated a lot of bitterness and unrest in the workplace. I started to hate what was happening in a company that, hitherto, I had grown to love so much, and one that I had become so proud to work for." Taylor shrugged dismissively. "In short, I just about had enough, and so decided the only thing to do was to get out." "So in other words, you jumped before you were pushed." A kind of taunting smirk played about the corners of Nicholas's thin lips. This irritated Taylor quite sharply, and he rushed to defend his decision. "Oh, no, I wouldn't say that," he said. "On the contrary, senior management often assured me that my job was safe, and that I had always been a well-valued member of the company, and, as such, always would be." "All the more reason to have stood your ground, then," Nicholas said. He leaned slowly back in his seat, steepling his fingers together and resting them on his chin as he continued to carefully appraise his candidate with those deep brown eyes of his. Taylor shrugged. Christ, he hated these curveball interviews. Well, I suppose I could have done, but as I said, I didn't like the path the company was going down. At the end of the day, there's no point in staying in a place where you become increasingly unhappy and restless. Indeed not. Nicholas parted his steeple fingers from his chin and leaned forward in his seat. He folded his arms and rested them on the desk. So then, he said, what made you apply for this job? Well, I believe all my previous experience in this line of work, coupled with my keen interest in the role and strong ambition to progress in my career, would prove highly useful to your company. Deep down inside, Taylor knew all too well that this answer was one of the most cliched ones any job seeker could give. Overly rehearsed, robotic even. But despite that, if his answer got him the job, then who the hell cared? I see, Nicholas smiled. Was that a smile to indicate the manager's satisfaction with Taylor's answer, or was it just a smile of cynicism at that cliched answer? And how much do you know about our company, Mr. Taylor? Well, I do know that you have a bloody powerful central heating system in here, Taylor thought, as he felt the sweat starting to pour more profusely from his pores. God, there was no need to have the bloody thing turned up as high as this. Were they all ultra-nesh in this place, or what? Trying to remove his concentration away from the oppressive heat and focus it exclusively on conducting a satisfactory, hopefully fruitful interview, Taylor cleared his throat and said, well, I noted from your website that a sudden loud ringing sound, an ear-piercing ringing sound that emitted from Nicholas's inside jacket pockets cut Taylor's words short, and just as he'd done outside in reception when he'd been startled by the screaming commotion belting out from the main office, he jumped in his seat. Christ, he thought, why was everything so abnormally and irritatingly loud and hot in this place? Excuse me, Nicholas said, raising one hand to stay his candidate while he reached into his jacket pocket with the other. He fished out a large, shiny red mobile phone and pressed the answer button. Hello, Nicholas here. How may I help? A few seconds passed as Nicholas relaxed back in his seat and listened to the caller, nodding every now and then as he did so. Yes? Yes? Okay. Right? Then he flicked his eyes up at Taylor. Yes, he's here with me, right now. He's just arrived for his interview. A wide smile slowly spread across Nicholas's features. It was a smile that Taylor did not much like, for it did not seem to reach the manager's eyes, and even made him feel a little, well, uncomfortable. But Nicholas's next words, punctuated by a low but grating chuckle, sent Taylor's odd feeling of unease rising to an even higher level. Don't worry, I'll take care of him. The way Nicholas said it and the way he chuckled, he sounded like a hitman about to take care of a potential victim. Christ, why am I even thinking along those lines? Taylor inwardly scolded himself. Ridiculous. Nicholas was just an ordinary office boss holding an ordinary job interview. Even so, there was no denying that the man's behaviour was becoming stranger and stranger, and Taylor could not help being more than a little troubled by that. Nicholas finished talking on the phone and slipped it back into his inside pocket. He noticed Taylor's quizzical stare and hastened to elaborate. You may well look as if you don't know what on earth is going on here, Mr. Taylor, Nicholas said. Well, under the circumstances, that is perfectly natural. I don't know what you mean. Taylor was now becoming more and more puzzled, blustered, and this prompted Nicholas to raise a calming hand. Please, Mr. Taylor, try to relax. Everything is under control now. You are here with us, where you belong. Everything is going to be just fine now. You'll see. See what? Taylor's mind was now starting to race like mad. Everything was beginning to take on a rather unreal quality. He was starting to feel a little dizzy, a little sick. And for some strange reason, he felt that he was no longer being assessed for an ordinary office job, but for something more, well, something more ominous. Something very unsavoury even. Oh, and if you're wondering who that was just on the phone, Nicholas said, that was the man upstairs, as we like to call him in our jolly little company here. Taylor could almost see Nicholas's capitalised description of the man upstairs in his mind. Such was the appreciable sense of importance and, what else, honour, that the manager seemed to put on the identified caller. Was the man upstairs the managing director? Taylor wondered, but then he dismissed the possibility. No, he couldn't be. Nicholas himself was the managing director, as he'd made clear at the beginning of the interview. So who? You didn't fit in up there, did you, Mr. Taylor? Nicholas said, those searching brown eyes staring so deeply into Taylor's own that he, Taylor, almost felt as if they were boring deep down into his very soul. And those penetrating pupils seemed to be getting as unbearably discomforting as the ever-increasing heat was getting in here. Taylor slowly slipped a hand, a visibly trembling hand, into the breast pocket of his jacket for a handkerchief to dab away the beads of perspiration from his brow. But it wasn't just his forehead that needed cooling down, for his whole body had now become so hot and sticky that it would have gladly welcomed a nice cold shower. The combination of the intense heat and the strange swirling fogginess that had now completely engulfed Taylor's brain made him feel as if he was going to pass out at any moment. Though Nicholas's authoritative, so irritatingly authoritative, voice was now sounding more and more distant, Taylor could still just about register every single word the manager uttered. Then Taylor heard another sound, that of the door being opened with a harsh creak. As he flung his blurred gaze in that direction, he discerned a form framed in the doorway, the form of a woman, and a damned attractive woman at that. Long raven black hair, a well-chiselled face, a curvaceous figure whose curves were stunningly accentuated by the tight red dress she wore. She looked as if he had just emerged from a disco rather than from an outer office. Nicholas's face instantly lit up as he watched this luscious lady walk slowly into the room, her high heels giving her gait a rather sultry appeal. "Oh, Lil, nice to see you," Nicholas said, grinning at the dark-haired beauty like some pathetic Cheshire cat. "I'm glad you popped in, as I have a nice little surprise for you." The instant Taylor heard the name Lil, it triggered in his memory what the receptionist had told him before, just after he'd been startled by the commotion coming from inside the main workplace. Lil, the devilish and cheeky screamer. So this must be her, the office clown, the overgrown boisterous schoolgirl. And, Christ, she was certainly sexy with it too, Taylor thought approvingly. The one's eyebrows arched questioningly. "Oh really? A surprise for me?" "That's right," Nicholas nodded. He waved a hand at the man sitting across the desk from him. "And here he is." Mouth gaping open in utter incomprehension, Taylor flicked his wide-eyed stare from the woman to Nicholas and back to the woman again. All this was getting weirder and weirder by the second. He no longer felt as if he were attending a simple job interview. He felt more like he was being made the victim of some strange, silly joke concocted by God knows who. It all just seemed like one big crazy dream. If it was, he just hoped he would wake up from it any second now, before it got even crazier. "Mr. Taylor, meet my trusty assistant, Lil," Nicholas said, waving an introductory hand at the woman, who was now smiling as widely and delightedly as her boss was. Then he did the same introductory gesture at Taylor. "Lil, meet Mr. Taylor, our new recruit." New recruit? Taylor wondered in surprise. Did that mean Nicholas had decided to give the job to Taylor there and then? "Very pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Taylor," the woman said, her big green eyes glinting approvingly as she flicked them up and down the smart-suited candidate's form. "We've been waiting for you." As she stepped slowly towards him, Taylor felt a heavy fragrant odour assail his nostrils, suggesting that she was wearing some kind of powerful, expensive perfume. "So, Lil," Nicholas said, leaning back in his seat and clasping his hands behind his head. "Are you ready for him now?" Lil looked at her boss and nodded slowly, her luscious red lips curving into a smile of intent. "Oh, yes," she said, in a tone barely above a whisper. "We're ready for him, all right." Nicholas smiled. "Good." Taylor, eyes darting madly from the face of Nicholas to the face of his rather vampish assistant, couldn't stand any more of this crazy and extremely unsettling game any longer. "Look," he began, raising his voice to emphasise the concern. "I don't know what's going on here, Mr. Nicholas, but I'd like an explanation." Nicholas's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, so you want an explanation, do you, Mr. Taylor?" Then he shot a knowing, somewhat mischievous smile at his female assistant, who gave the same kind of smile back, conveying the impression to Taylor that both were sharing some secret joke about him. The air of dark conspiracy seemed to be pouring out of both of them like an almost palpable thing. The feeling sent alarm bells ringing through his mind. Suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, Taylor wanted to flee from that office as fast as he could. "Well, to be bluntly honest, Mr. Taylor," Nicholas went on, leaning forward again in his seat and folding his arms on his desk, "there is no real need to give you an explanation. All you need to do now is to just concentrate. Yes, concentrate, and reflect on two very significant words which I am about to relay to you." Bloody hell, Taylor thought. Now this guy is starting to sound like some demented hypnotist. His brow furrowed in puzzlement at Nicholas's instructions. "And what might those two words be?" he asked. "Lawson Industries," Nicholas announced, the two words slowly, emphatically, as if to ensure that Taylor heard them loud and clear. Lawson Industries. Mused Taylor. Those two words certainly did sound very familiar to him. And the more he thought of them, the more he found his mind recollecting, gradually forming a clearer picture of his links with Lawson Industries. Oh yes, it was all coming back to him now. And what he was now recalling about the whole business he didn't like. Oh no, he didn't like it one little bit. It was an uncomfortable memory, and such a dark memory. Taylor had worked for Lawson Industries as a section manager. At first, the company had regarded him as a highly valued and trustworthy employee, but once new management took over, all that corporate sugar and spice soon went right out the window. In fact, you could say that it was his job, a job which he'd been led to believe he was going to have for life, that went right out of the window too. It was the worst case scenario of a new broom sweeping clean, but in the case of Taylor's cold-hearted sudden sacking, it was a case of a new broom sweeping dirty. Bastards! The bitter memory of the disgusting way he'd been treated always sent Taylor's mind raging with fury, and it was this level of fury that had driven him to exact a drastic revenge on the whole stinking, rotten, arrogant management team that had been responsible for pushing him out of the door. And what a sweet revenge it had been too, creeping surreptitiously into the building of Lawson Industries one night, whilst his treacherous new bosses were having a stay-over meeting, boozing and bawling their secretaries more like. Taylor had burned the whole bloody place down, and with it all those snobby bigots who had so callously and disrespectfully destroyed his life without even a single word of thanks for all those years of dedicated service he'd given the company. They had felt the heat, the full heat of Taylor's wrath and anger. Oh yes, they'd certainly felt the heat all right. He only wished he could have had just one glimpse of their charred bodies to make his sheer satisfaction and joy at their demise as complete. It would have been the icing on the cake. But now, as the bittersweet memory of Lawson Industries faded and his mind refocused on the present, Taylor himself was starting to feel a different kind of heat. The full heat of the overpowerful central heating system in this office. But was it really just the central heating that was making him sweat so much? Or was it something else? But well, what else could it be? And was this really just an ordinary office to which he had come for a simple job interview? Somehow, for some strange reason, Taylor was beginning to think that it wasn't. So just what the hell was this place? And why the hell were these two behaving as strange as they were? The thought of the word hell then seemed to send a strange, intense feeling running through Taylor's whole body. At the same time, an equally acute, rather ominous feeling began to grip his stomach, tightening it like some fiercely clenching fist. And the sensation was growing so strong, so unbearable, that he almost felt that his whole guts were about to be ripped right out of his body. Yes, Mr. Taylor, you were so right to think just then of a word that, to be bluntly honest, perfectly sums up where you are right now, Nicholas said. Then he uttered what sounded like a sadistic mocking chuckle, a sound that sent the blood running cold in Taylor's veins, despite the intense heat of the office. God, Taylor thought with utter disbelief, was this guy a bloody mind reader too? Lil chortled along with her boss, just as sadistically, just as mockingly. The pair was looking at Taylor as if he were nothing more than some ridiculous fool that had just stumbled aimlessly into their office. And the more they laughed at him, and the more that laughter rang coarsely in his ears, the more his sense of humiliation began to grow. He had never felt so insignificant, so small, so inferior in front of a couple of people. What had started out as an ordinary job interview had now deteriorated into a kind of crazy circus, and he was seemingly the biggest clown in it. Well, for some strange reason, at least in their eyes. Taylor was now utterly struck dumb. Although he opened his mouth to voice his anger and indignation at his two chuckling hosts, no sound would come out, for his vocal cords now seemed to be utterly paralysed. It was all just so weird, so unreal. He no longer did he feel as if he were in the process of an ordinary job interview, but in something more disturbing, sinister. And those fears were confirmed by Nicholas's next words. "You see, Mr. Taylor, you're not here simply to be considered for a job. Oh no, no way. You are, in fact, here because you've been sent here." Taylor's eyebrows arched questioningly. Again he tried to speak, but still his throat remained defiantly frozen. So his question remained just a facial expression, which Nicholas read immediately. I know you want to ask me sent here. By whom?" Nicholas went on, his lips curved into a grin that seemed to suggest he was enjoying every sweet moment of Taylor's discomfort and anxiety. "Well, I'll tell you. You were sent here, or, to be more precise, down here, by the man upstairs to whom I referred earlier." Then he slowly leaned forward in his seat, as if to emphasise his next words, and said, "And you certainly can't argue with senior management up there, you know. In fact, I've been trying to do it for centuries, and I'm still no nearer to uprooting Big Boss Man than I was when I first started all those, centuries ago." What the hell was this grinning goon on about? Centuries? He was just spouting gibberish, talking in riddles. And then, like a horrible bolt from the blue, the shocking realisation of the true nature of Taylor's situation finally hit him. It was as if the curtain had suddenly been brutally yanked up by an authoritative hand right from high above Big Boss Man to reveal the stark reality of it all. And as much as Taylor tried to deny it, tried to shut his mind off from it, the horrible truth was now becoming all too clear. It was as if his full memory had suddenly been opened wide, and what it was now revealing to him he didn't like one little bit. But what could he do about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He knew, to his horror, that there was no going back now, no chance whatsoever of redemption. He would have to accept his fate, his eternal fate. Then, as the intense heat in the office stepped up to become the raging fires of hell, and as the flames began to lick at his now steaming hot body, the last thing Taylor saw of the two images, Nicholas and Lilith, before the ground suddenly opened up beneath his feet, and he plunged down, down, down into the fiery pit of eternal damnation, was a hideous horned figure, Nicholas alias Old Nick, the devil, and a naked, equally horned female, Lil alias Lilith, the notorious succubus. They were both laughing at him, cruel mocking laughter that would resound in his head just as perpetually as the screams of the people he had so callously burned to death in his former workplace would. The interview from hell was now fully closed. That is, until the next applicant came along.